So now let's look into the regulation of cell-based therapies. First of all, think for a minute about what regulations are in the first place. There are a set of minimum standards, and those standards are developed and adopted by governments to ensure the safety of people and or animals and or the environment, right? So we regulate things that we want to be safe for ourselves and for others. And regulation is not unique to cell-based therapies. There are many different industries that are regulated. Think about food and the electrical and power industry, or transportation, or construction. What all of those industries have in common is that there's a potential risk to humans or the environment, and we want to minimize and manage those risks by providing guidelines and rules for everyone to follow. And in the context of medicines like cell-based therapies, the regulation need is no different. In the U.S., we have a regulatory body called the Food and Drug Administration, and the FDA regulates medicines, including cell-based therapy. But it's similar in other countries. For example, in Europe, we have the European Medicines Agency. And so what you think about these regulatory agencies is that they work in collaboration with the companies who manufacture therapeutics. And their goal together is to really ensure that the medicines that you and your friends and your family have the opportunity to receive are safe and effective every single time they're administered. There's many challenges to doing that well in cell-based therapy, and that's why these regulations play such an important role. Now, how we actually do this, and in fact, one of the key ways to how we do this is by companies identifying and adopting what we call current good manufacturing practices, or CGMPs. So that small c doesn't stand for cell, it stands for current, meaning that we keep improving on the best ways to manufacture these products for safety and efficacy. And so it's the minimum set of requirements, and those requirements relate to the methods and the facilities and the controls and even the documentation related to manufacturing these products. Now, at its heart, CGMPs really ensure that manufacturing processes are under control and everything is performing as expected. Now, from a regulatory perspective, what does this mean? It means that you need to be able to say exactly what you're going to do in terms of manufacturing the product, and then do exactly what you say you did. This makes sense. But you also need to be able to prove that you actually did that. That includes documentation, and improve on that process as you learn more over time. And this happens in part because you give the regulators an opportunity to review and provide feedback on your approach. So this is collaborative, but then the regulations, once set in place, really actually constrain your ability to actually change the process because you've already agreed on what would maintain CGMP. So these CGMP requirements in the US are actually codified law, and they're broken down into 10 different areas of CGMP, ranging from the facilities to the raw materials to the distribution. These sections are each individually important, but together they make up a system that allow us to develop and get a safe product to the patient. The key point here is that no matter if you're making a small molecule therapeutic or a cell-based therapeutic, you need to follow each of these components of CGMP practice to be in compliance with the law and also following the spirit of the regulations to produce these medicines safely. So let's take a look at the breakdown of several of these components and the complexities and challenges that relate to applying cGMP to manufacturing cell therapies. So the first challenge of cell therapy is related to the personnel. The personnel need to understand and follow aseptic technique and training. We've covered that in depth elsewhere, but it means that we don't contaminate the sample. And in part, that means that we're going to wear a higher grade of personal protective equipment, or PPE. This is not so the cells don't hurt us, but so that we don't contaminate the cells with particulate matter, such as bacteria from our own skin. From a building and facilities perspective, there's also several cGMP requirements. Many of these processes and steps that we're taking with the cells occur in what looks like an open room. And so the open room's air quality has to be very high and operate much like a clean room in terms of how often we change the air. You'll also see in those rooms many biosafety cabinets, again to control the sterility and the circulation of the air. And then when we think about the equipment itself, we have to make sure that the equipment is cleaned properly because there's a risk of contamination as well as cross-contamination as we make a batch for one patient and then the next patient. One of the biggest challenges, though, for cell therapy manufacturing is actually the raw material itself. Note that our raw materials include biological cells, and so that material is inherently variable. And we also have novel raw materials such as viral vectors in certain therapies. So when you think about the most extreme or challenging example of this variability of the raw material, you would think about an autologous cell therapy. Here, the dosage of the cells that are made as the medicine actually come from a patient, and a patient who is in fact sick, and every dose is made for every patient individually. And so every batch of starting material is naturally variable. Next, let's talk about the challenge of production and process controls. Remember that cell-based therapies go through many different steps that can actually produce opportunity for contamination or cross-contamination or inherent issues with the materials in the processes themselves. For example, think of the tubing. And so that is a very important part in controlling the processes related to the equipment and the raw materials. And then once you've achieved that final product, you need to package and label it. And here again, there's quite a bit of importance because you could have one dose is one batch, and that dose goes to only one patient. So recording and all of that information and tracking it is very important. Now, in case of holding and distribution, one of the challenges for cell-based therapies is a very, very short shelf life. Sometimes these cells are moved at very low temperatures, and sometimes they're moved in very short time periods. And so that challenge of actually distributing a drug that can't sit on the shelf is very important. For laboratory controls, you also have to think about the challenges that cell therapies face. First, there's a number of novel process assays, things that we do only for cell therapies that we don't do for protein-based therapeutics, for example. And so we have to test every dose, and we may not be always able to trace that back exactly to biological function. And finally, because there are all of these steps which are challenging and important, documentation is a very important part of this process. In fact, for cell-based therapies, there's much more documentation involved than for example, production of recombinant proteins. Part of this is because of the risks involved, part of it is because of the number of steps involved, but it's all intended to provide a safe product for the patient. And each regulatory agency may have its own set of conditions and requirements and CGMP expectations. In the US, we have the FDA, but as you can see in this map, many countries that either produce cell therapies in that country or allow the citizens and residents of that country to receive cell therapy have their own regulatory agency counterparts. And so that harmonization of the regulations from one country to another is very important, especially if the cell therapy is made in one country and transported to another. In fact, in order for a company to sell a cell-based therapy in a specific country, that company has to be licensed by the regulatory agency within that country. So what have we learned? First, cell therapies are regulated products and they're regulated for human safety. And for that reason, the production must abide by CGMPs, or Current Good Manufacturing Practices. Now, the cell therapies face a number of challenges when meeting those regulations because of the novel and variable nature of the materials involved. But these regulations exist for the well-being and safety of the patients so that we can ensure the safety, the efficacy, and also the consistency of this product every time it makes its way into a patient.